I want to get you to comment on a business model that I've seen emerge in the last couple of years, and I'll illustrate it with an interview I did with a young engineer from Costa Rica who went to Detroit and he got educated, became an electrical engineer, went back to his home country, and now he has a company that I think is kind of going to be the cutting edge of this. He said, "Look, we have industry in Costa Rica. We have a poor grid, and so these industries, the grid goes down, and then production ceases, and it's a real pain, and it costs them a lot of money." He said, "I go in with a combination of cheap Chinese solar panels, uh, cheap batteries, and digital controls. And I then use my engineering expertise to build an integration model. I integrate that system into their business, and now they've got cheaper power, and it's always available. They're not at the mercy of the grid." And I'm beginning to see this more and more. And I wonder the extent to which all of this wonderful technology on both the supply side and the demand side now becomes an engineering issue and an integration issue.
Yes, I think that's probably true. I think there are always going to be questions about, the sort of trade terms and tariffs and things like this as well that are going to affect the equation. But this is exactly what you would do, isn't it? If you run a business and, as you say, the power goes out and you can't produce and it's very disruptive, you still have to pay your workers even though they can't actually work at that particular point. And someone comes along and says, "Look, I'm going to give you something that's going to give you reliable power." You're going to do it. Of course you are. And one of the studies that Ember had out fairly recently is looking at basically the fact that if you put solar panels together with an appropriate volume of batteries, you can basically use the solar generated electricity pretty much all around the day. You can have 24-hour solar. And in a country such as Costa Rica, which is near the equator, where you've got very, very good sunlight conditions pretty much all the way around, is an absolutely prime candidate for that. You're also going to be you're removing yourself from the risk of supply disruptions in another way as well, because if there's a big political event or a big natural disaster or something, sometimes oil and gas can't reach countries, and there literally is the lights literally go out because of that. So you're also isolating yourself from that kind of shock if you go down that route.
Let's talk about Pakistan for a couple of minutes. Over the last few years, its adoption, a really rapid adoption of cheap solar panels, has kind of revolutionized the power system because the grid was unreliable and expensive and didn't get very, far into the countryside. And all of a sudden, Pakistanis, just citizens, began adopting this, rooftop solar. And actually, there was a drop in demand on the grid. There was so much rooftop generation. And it seems like that was a lesson that other countries then went, "Hey, I kind of like that." And now they're trying to do something similar. Does that mean that we're maybe at the beginning of a distributed energy resources uh, uh, boom driven by consumers?
Yes, I mean, I think this has been increasingly the case in a number of countries and a number of regions of the world anyway, because simply because of the price advantages, and also in some cases because grid connections are unreliable. I remember a former colleague doing some research on Bangladesh, for example, sort of 20 years ago, where you could wait for years to get a grid connection to your village, but you go and get a few solar panels and batteries, and you can at least have the kind of minimum amount of electricity. So yes, I think, and the declining cost of everything, solar panels, batteries, and so on, just makes it all more likely that we will. I mean, Pakistan itself is an interesting case, and I don't feel we should really talk about it being Pakistan that did this. We should really talk about people in Pakistan doing this who were, frustrated with the grid being providing really expensive electricity and it kept falling over. So it's definitely not a government-led transition. It's a citizen business-led change, and undoubtedly for the people who've done it, it's great. But there will be a large slice of the population for whom it's still unaffordable, and the problem is that the grid itself may become increasingly unaffordable and increasingly unreliable because of the changes that have taken place. So Ideally, a sensible government will actually try to make this happen on a planned, organised basis with appropriate amounts of transmission being built and appropriate amounts of storage and so on, so that basically in the end everyone benefits.
Let's toss a little theory into the discussion here because A.E. Rogers brought out his, talked about the innovative adopters, early adopters, and that's become, you know, common language in these kinds of discussions. But the really key point here is that is his bell curve. All of those adopters are on a bell curve. And so the innovators and adopters are on the far left side and the laggards are on the far right side. And any technology that you introduce into an economy is going to go up that curve. And it's how fast it goes through the curve seems to be determined by the policy framework and the policies that are in place. And it just happens that some countries are going to be, have a better foresight, they'll have better strategies, they're more aggressive, whatever, and some won't. And that just is the nature of the transition.
It's definitely driven by policy, but I think also when you get to the stage we're at now with solar panels, certainly, and maybe EVs in some countries, it's increasingly just driven by market forces as well. So the two things are extremely important. But yeah, I mean, as we're seeing in the US now, policy decisions such as we want to halt a lot of wind farm building can have a really far reaching effect on the entire industry and the investment landscape. So yeah, policy absolutely matters. I think one of the interesting things about this is with most of the key components of the clean energy transition, we're actually really a long way down the other side of the bell curve now. Solar panels, yes. Wind turbines, pretty much. Batteries, definitely. EVs in some countries, absolutely, yeah. Heat pumps in some places, yes, as well. And that's actually the bulk of the chunk of what we need. You chuck in the grid infrastructure as well, and that's the bulk of what we need.
That's a very good point. Is that we're not at the beginning of the transition by any stretch of the imagination. We're well up the curve on that. Let's conclude our interview, Richard, with a discussion of fossil fuel demand outlook. And again, coming back to Canada, we have got this crazy idea that we are going to become an oil and gas superpower by building more LNG and building a million barrel a day pipeline to the West Coast and to the North Coast. And then it, and but your study shows that we're very close to fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas, fossil fuel peak, and decline is going to begin in short order.
Yes, and there are two trends here that are important, and China plays a central role in both of them. First of all, China has been the main driver of increasing fossil fuel demand now for 15 years. So if we see fossil fuel demand start to decline in China, that obviously has a massive impact on global fossil fuel demand. Already the OECD countries are reducing fossil fuel demand. That's been there for a decade or more. So really it will only be the non-OECD countries where we expect to see rising demand. But what's happening in those other non-OECD countries is that they're importing increasing amounts of Chinese-made clean energy technology. And in some cases, such as India, there's also manufacturing at scale and a government attempt to catch up in areas such as batteries and claim a large slice of that market. So there's every chance that the predicted or expected non-OECD oil demand, fossil fuel demand, won't materialize or will peak sooner than people realize. So yeah, just I think if you have an oil and gas industry in your country and you think that you can increase your share of whatever global market there is, well that's fine. But with due respect to a country such as Canada, that's probably going to be relatively difficult because a lot of the oil resources, compared with other oil extracting countries, are expensive. And you've got new players coming into the equation, such as Guyana, with massive plans to ramp up what I understand is fairly cheap production. So you're competing in a field that's going to become increasingly tight. Also, if every country in the world maintains a production excess, then prices are going to go down for oil and gas, and so you're going to be in a situation where you're losing more and more money. So I think all the while you're thinking about supporting production for maybe 5 years or whatever, you've really got to be thinking about your exit plan. Because if you don't think about your exit plan, it's going to be a really messy exit.
And that's a good point on which to end our interview is that petrostates, and I think, Canada is dependent enough, dependent enough upon oil and gas revenues and being a part of its industry that it is a petrostate in this context of this conversation. You have stranded growth models, stranded assets, and you're suddenly caught with your pants down, as it were. You're naked as the tide goes out because you haven't planned ahead. You haven't built new industries to create employment, and or you haven't added value to your resources, those sorts of things. And I think that idea of stranded growth models is an important one.
Yes, and there are many other ways in which people who have no connection with the fossil fuel industry are also involved in this. Pensions can be invested in fossil fuel stocks, for example, and in the UK it's something like about 7% of all pensions are tied up in the fossil fuel industry. That's a huge amount. Governments can build their economic forecasts on the expectation that oil and gas revenue will keep on coming, and so if it doesn't, then they're in a little bit of a pickle. So yeah, you've got to in that position. You've really got to look at the world with open eyes. Otherwise, you're really failing your citizens. It's kind of your job as a government to plan ahead for unexpected, for things that you regard as negative as well as things that you regard as positive. And if a government with a copious oil and gas industry isn't looking at what's happening in China and isn't looking at what it means for the rest of the world, then there's a lot of potential for unexpected and unpleasant surprises down the pipe.
On that note, Richard, thank you very much for this. This has been a very insightful conversation, and there's so much in this report. Anybody who wants to look at it can find it on Ember's website. It gets released on September 9th. So, Richard, thank you very much for this.
Thanks, Markham. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.